Villains. Oftentimes, the best part of a movie. Can't live with them, can't feed them to a pack of rabid hyenas, usually. Villains are the people we love to hate or fear, with the occasional modicum of empathy. But something's been happening with villains lately. If you found yourself nodding along to the logic of a diabolical plot, or feeling more empathetic than usual towards a film's antagonist, you're not alone. Today's villains, from Killmonger in Black Panther to Screenslaver in Incredibles 2, have become weirdly relatable, each equipped with their own cogent critiques of the world.
People will trade quality for ease every time.
Villainy is, and always has been, a reflection of the value systems and fears of the time. So how did we get from this to this, and what does it say about our past and our world today? Well, we're gonna find out in this Wisecrack edition on the cinematic history of villainy, and warning, there's a ton of spoilers here for movies both old and new. We have to explore multiple eras and see how film villains embody the spirit and anxieties of the times. Now, a quick disclaimer, none of these trends are absolute. Villains can break the mold or jump back into the past for inspiration, but what we're discussing here are noticeable trends among some of the most enduring films of each era. We're going to start our journey from the simple mustache-twirling villain to the complex philosophizing radical by looking at the 1950s and early 1960s, the height of the war that wasn't hot. In the post-World War II party in the suburbs era of American history, describing our world seemed pretty simple. We were the heroes who saved the world from the evil Nazis, and were now tasked with staving off the also evil USSR. It was very black and white, and so were our villains. Well, yeah, literally, but also metaphorically. Movie screens were full of bad Russian people, bad Asian people, and very bad aliens. What do all these naughty dudes have in common? They're the other, an inherent, inexplicable evil that's stoked on destroying America and our apple pie values. Sometimes that other took the form of an amorphous red-for-commie blob, or the creature from the Black Lagoon. Other times, the other was an alien hatched in a pod and designed to look exactly like you, as in the Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which some critics say represented the fear of communist brainwashing and infiltration.
And you're reborn into an untroubled world.
Where everyone's the same?
Exactly.
What a world.
Also in the 50s, the movie industry went way back to basics, producing a number of biblical sagas with running times of 4 hours or more. These expensive epics proved massively popular, with 3 ranking in the top 10 highest-grossing films of the decade. Perhaps this was partially because they so perfectly embodied Cold War propaganda, which depicted a face-off between God-fearing Americans and the godless communists. Ben-Hur showed an aristocratic Jew being persecuted by an evil Roman commander, while Quo Vadis pits new Christian converts against the evil Emperor Nero and his Roman Empire.
The world is mine, and mine to end.
And the Ten Commandments depicts good old Moses staring down the Egyptian Emperor Ramses. These films all portrayed the noble Judeo-Christian taking on a cruel, powerful despot of a non-monotheistic religion. These villains were representative of larger groups of bad people who wanted to cancel baseball Tupperware parties.
Brain has not only been washed, as they say, it has been dry cleaned.
Even when villains weren't explicitly foreign or pagan, they were just anti-American communist double agents as seen in a flurry of Cold War propaganda films. Later, spy mania of the 1960s would also reflect Cold War anxiety, with James Bond facing off against various agents of Smersh, the imaginary Russian intelligence agency.
The Cold War in Istanbul will not remain cold very much longer.
What all these movies had in common was an us versus them mentality, with no good commies portrayed as pure and simply evil. One-dimensional foreign/communist/alien/blob villains took a backseat in the late 60s and 70s as we saw a definitive shift in the portrayal of villains. It was fitting for a time of major social turbulence and soul-searching, as the civil rights movement in Vietnam made visible some of the not-so-perfect aspects of America, like racism and war. This period also saw a startling drop in public trust of government, a phenomenon that changed movie villains dramatically as outrage over the war met outrage about Nixon's tapes. Notably, 1970s movies shined a light on the corrupt social systems that Americans were increasingly disillusioned with. Evil politicians and public officials loomed large. Popular political thriller All the President's Men brought the Watergate scandal to the big screen in 1976. Fictional accounts also touched on institutional corruption, like in Steven Spielberg's Jaws, which depicts a crooked mayor who cares more about tourism revenue than keeping people from becoming shark bait.
For Christ's sake, tomorrow's the 4th of July, and we will be open for business. It's going to be one of the best summers we've ever had.
Further depictions of the evil and mighty came in Chinatown, in which the sinister billionaire rejects audiences' judgments of him by claiming that his evil acts were brought about by his environment.
People never have to face the fact that at the right time and the right place, they're capable of anything.
The suggestion is that circumstances of power make the villain rather than any innate nature. Corrupt cop films were another popular way of portraying the power struggles taking place. Serpico, based on a true story, depicts a world in which police corruption is an assumed fact.
You fire without looking? You fire without a warning, without a fucking brain in your head?
In this world, bribes and brutality are the coffee and donuts of police work. So much so that Al Pacino's Serpico is distrusted because he's not willing to accept bribes.
Let's face it, who can trust a cop who don't take money?
Corrupt cops were mainstays on the big screen, popping up in The Godfather, White Lightning, The French Connection, and The Conversation, to name a few. Institutions, it seems, had lost their presumption of goodwill, and as a result, we started seeing villains who embody the very broken systems people were angry about. Take Nurse Ratched from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, who turned a benevolent profession into one that turns vivid individuals into drugged-up dependent ghosts of themselves.
You're no crazier than the average ass out walking around on the streets, and that's it.
In a similarly bleak depiction of institutionalization, Escape from Alcatraz renders prisoners sympathetic heroes struggling against the efforts of an evil warden. Something very similar can be seen in Cool Hand Luke. In all these cases, the person tasked with imposing law and order or societal norms is recast as the villain. The 1970s further muddied the waters by blurring the line between hero and villain until the distinctions became all but meaningless. These characters are depicted as conflicted, heavily flawed protagonists with questionable, even hideous morals. In Martin Scorsese's 1976 film Taxi Driver, Travis Bickle is one such heroic villain, or villainous hero depending on your perspective. He swings on the pendulum of violently bad to violently good-ish as he goes from plotting to gun down a presidential candidate to plotting to rescue a 12-year-old prostitute. In the previous year's Dog Day Afternoon, novice crook and hero-slash-villain Sonny Wartzik botches a bank robbery and spontaneously takes all the workers hostage. However, we soon learn the reason for Sonny's dalliance with crime. He needed the money to help his wife Leon get sexual reassignment surgery.
Right away, Sonny wanted to get me money for the sex change operation, but where was he gonna get it?
We find out that Sonny is a quality dude who pays his parents rent and doesn't typically go around holding up banks. Not your villain of the past. Meanwhile, one particularly popular series, Star Wars, stands out as markedly simplistic in this era of more complex villains. It might seem to counter our theory, as it presents a pretty basic black and white paradigm of good versus evil, even if it goes against the grain later on with Ewoks reminiscent of the Viet Cong. The 1980s backpedaled hard on the anti-villain by reveling in more cartoonish villains who directly embodied the biggest threats of the time. Effectively, it ushered back in an us versus them paradigm by tapping into the fears surrounding the war on drugs. Unsurprisingly, the villains of the time wanted a piece of that sweet, sweet drug money in films like Scarface, To Live and Die in LA, Beverly Hills Cop, and Raw Deal. This depiction of evil drug lords could be seen as a yin-yang response to the less-than-savory cops of the 70s films. Take Tango and Cash, which depicted two roguish cops who are treated as irrepressible protagonists, despite engaging in some of the exact same violence Serpico condemned. However, they're portrayed as the best cops in the city because their unconventional tactics have cost local drug lord and rat-kissing villain Yves Perret oodles of money. Then, said Kingpin, as if schooled in the bad cop films of the 70s, gets them falsely incriminated for murder. The film ultimately comes down hard on the side of cops and a by any means necessary model of policing.
I've been a policeman for 12 years, and I think it's the best organization in the country.
At the same time, the decade saw the resurgence of Cold War anxieties. As President Ronald Reagan increased military spending and ended arms control, Americans rediscovered their fear of nuclear war. At the same time, evil Russians had their moment in the sun with films like Rocky IV, which remained the highest-grossing sports flick until 2009. It's also been accused of being pure anti-Soviet propaganda because of its villain, Soviet boxer Ivan Drago, who was decidedly not a charmer.
I must break you.
The film Red Heat really won the villain jackpot in its depiction of Soviet drug lord Viktor Rostavili, who, in a trifecta of evil, also murdered the protagonist's partner. But arguably the clearest example of 1980's Cold War villains came with 1984's Red Dawn, which imagined Soviet forces invading America, and worse, taking photos in our national parks. The film's director John Milius explicitly saw the film as a warning to Americans to take seriously the threat of a Soviet invasion via Central America. And if this seems like a scaremonger for you, consider that Milius was the direct inspiration for this guy.
Smokey, my friend, you're entering a world of pain.
Despite some return to the other as the enemy, there are hints of the 70s skepticism towards institutions in the 1980s. When villains are not pure caricatures from a Nancy Reagan fever dream, we see them continue exploiting corrupt institutions for personal gain. Gordon Garrida's Good Gecko, for instance, uses the corrupt financial industry to fulfill his own gold-plated desires. Meanwhile, Die Hard's Hans Gruber emerges as one of the decade's most enduring villains when he and his cronies seize a high-rise building and take hostages during a Christmas party. He operates under the guise of being a terrorist exacting revenge on an evil corporation.
Due to the Nakatomi Corporation's legacy of greed around the globe, they are about to be taught a lesson in the real use of power.
But interestingly enough, his moral high ground crumbles when it's revealed that, just like Gordon Gekko, he's really only after cold hard cash.
So that's what this is all about? F***ing robbery?
Put down the gun.
Why'd you have to nuke the whole building, Hans?
Well, when you steal $600, you can just disappear. When you steal 600 million, they will find you unless they think you're already dead.
In the 90s, American cinema swapped out the Reds for homegrown terrorists to fit a decade in which domestic terrorism and going postal dominated headlines. Fittingly, in cinema, it was an era of disgruntled middle-class dudes and bombers next door, a prime time for complex anti-villains who are fighting small, localized battles by radical means. Take the villain from Speed, Howard Payne. This former bomb squad officer turned extortionist turned psychopathic terrorist is partially motivated by that sweet $3.7 million, but he also expresses a sense of superiority.
You still don't get it, do you, Jack? Huh? The beauty of it. A bomb is made to explode. That's its meaning, its purpose.
That's bananas, but it's a hint of philosophy, a motivation beyond cold hard cash. Howard's more complicated than, say, Gruber in that he genuinely desires meaning and purpose. He just goes about getting them in the worst way possible. Same goes for Kevin Spacey's supremely sadistic John Doe in the 1995 film Seven, who sees himself as a chosen warrior in the crusade against everyday sin.
We see a deadly sin on every street corner, in every home, and we tolerate it. We tolerate it because it's common, it's trivial. We tolerate it morning, noon, and night. Well, not anymore. I'm setting the example.
By the end of the decade, Arlington Road became the pinnacle of the domestic terror genre, whose villain mans the girl at the block party as he carries out plans for his militant group's latest deadly bombing.
I'm a messenger. There's millions of us waiting to take up arms, ready to spread the word.
He claims to be pursuing a lofty, noble goal, but within his critique of government is also an indictment of the supposed niceties of Clinton-era prosperity.
Are you happy in your godless suburban life?
Trouble in Suburbia also abounded in American Beauty, which depicted the enemy as Lester's neighbor, the homophobic Nazi memorabilia hoarding Frank Fitz, who kills Lester after he rebuffs his romantic advancements. In both cases, the villains feel victimized by the system or circumstance and seek justice on their own icky terms. Sometimes these villains have genuinely noble causes as they rail against the systems that have wronged them. Take 1995's The Rock, in which Ed Harris's General Humble, a disgraced USMC brigadier general, threatens a nerve gas attack on San Francisco,
15 VX gas rockets into the heart of San Francisco. You've got 17 hours to deliver the money.
demanding that the families of slain Marines be compensated for their deaths. Here we come to an interesting question of whether noble ends justify violent means. In this way, the film acts as a prelude to the very questions being explored by current-day villains, though usually on a much wider scale. Movies couldn't not be changed by an event as pivotal as 9/11 and the subsequent War on Terror. With the 2000s came a new shift in movie villains, as America confronted an existential threat to its sense of safety and power in the world. Fittingly, the first two installments of Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy captured the popular imagination in this decade. In 2005's Batman Begins, we see the dangerous metropolis under attack by an international terrorist group called the League of Shadows, and its leader Ra's al Ghul, who, in a remarkably on-the-nose metaphor, wants to blow up Gotham's tallest skyscraper. Arguably the decade's most salient villain came, of course, with Heath Ledger's portrayal of the Joker in The Dark Knight. The Joker manifests as the spirit of terrorism, the embodiment of anarchy and chaos of a particularly destructive and nihilistic nature, as critic Douglas Kellner writes in his book Cinema Wars.
The only sensible way to live in this world is without rules.
In case the comparison between the Joker and real-world terrorism wasn't clear enough, Kellner notes that the film is bursting with 9/11 iconography. Nolan's film also gave us one of two coin-flipping evildoers with the character of Harvey Dent, alias Two-Face. A representation of how a confrontation with the Joker's evils can corrupt even the noblest person, Two-Face goes about deciding people's fates through a plunge into a completely meaningless existence of pure contingency and nihilism. Meanwhile, the Coen brothers' Anton Chigurh from No Country for Old Men also uses a coin to decide the fate of his victims. He doesn't kill out of greed, self-defense, or some kind of practical goal, leading one character to comment,
"He's a peculiar man. You might even say he has principles that transcend money or drugs or anything like that."
Indeed, Chigurh is quite simply an active nihilist who believes that if all morality is contrived, a coin flip is as good a way as any to decide who lives and dies. But you don't need a coin to affirm the random or meaningless nature of our lives or deaths. Take Martin Scorsese's 2006 film, The Departed, which featured Jack Nicholson as chief gangster Frank Costello. From merciless killing,
Jeez, she fell funny,
to his refusal to subscribe to any rules,
I don't want to be a product of my environment. I want my environment to be a product of me.
Frank's actions seem shaped by the belief that life is meaningless.
How's your mother?
She's on her way out.
You all are. Act accordingly.
Frank, who we later find out was an FBI informant, sees life as one long struggle, during which any actions that sustain you for just one more day are entirely excusable. Of course, plenty of other villain archetypes punctuated the 2000s. But if the 2000s were a time when the villainous creed was no creed at all, we've come a long way since then. Today, our villains are the product of an increasingly divided America bracing itself for impact. With trust in government, media, and religious faith at all-time lows, villains reflect America's innate skepticism towards systems, any systems, all the systems. Villains simply embody solutions that are way too radical and usually mind-bogglingly violent. The polar opposite of a 1950s villain, who represented an evildoer infiltrating an inherently good system in hopes of corrupting it, today's villains increasingly face objectively evil systems which they want to change for the better. The only thing that makes these characters villains rather than starry-eyed heroes is their means of carrying out that change.
You agree to end the war on drugs once and for all. My colleagues and I receive full legal immunity.
The classic caveat of, hey man, you'd be really cool if you weren't trying to kill half the world. For instance, Black Panther's Killmonger, played by Michael B. Jordan, has an entirely legitimate critique of how the world treats its black citizens and Wakanda's passivity as they suffer. In fact, Killmonger would argue that the real villains of the film are Wakandans who sit on a stockpile of vibranium while pretending to be a helpless third world country. Where Killmonger's perspective gets debatably tricky is in the means. He wants to ship Wakandan weapons all over the world and instigate a militant uprising.
The world's gonna start over, and this time we're on top. The sun will never set on the Wakandan Empire.
Though T'Challa defeats him and stops the scheme, he does go to the UN to admit Wakanda's real capacities and even establishes a Wakandian outreach center in Oakland, suggesting an end to Wakanda's isolationism. So Killmonger's radicalism actually brought about a less radical but positive change in policy. Then there's Mission Impossible 6's new utilitarian villain, August Walker / John Lark, who wants to destroy a third of the world in the hopes that the other 2/3 would come together in the wake of the attacks. Or as he says,
"There's never been peace without first a great suffering.
The greater the suffering, the greater the peace.
Or Infinity War's Thanos, who wants to kill half of everyone to solve resource scarcities that plague the universe. Or Incredibles 2's villain Screenslaver, who uses hypnotic screens to mind control her minions. Her personal beef with the system, that the endless repackaging of life into consumable media has made us all lazy, passive observers, and that superheroes are an integral part of the equation keeping us docile and meek. Her plan to change the system, mind control superheroes, and ruin their public approval rating so people will learn that they have to protect themselves. What all these villains share is a majorly out there plan that appeals to our country's growing fears that the world is screwed beyond repair, and the only way to fix it is to tear it all down. In this brave new world of villainy, we're able to empathize with the villains' critique of the system and their desire to change it. In this through-the-looking-glass reinterpretation of villainy, the heroes are almost inevitably cast as slightly flawed protectors of a status quo that no one's really happy with. In the grand scheme of things, contemporary villains seem to be a weird mirror image of 50s villains, who want to corrupt good institutions, whereas Killmonger types want to effect good change in corrupt institutions that just go about it in very bad ways. At the same time, our contemporary villains seem to have merged the complexity and sometimes apparent innocence of 90s villains while broadening the social critiques of the 70s and standing in opposition to the nihilism of the 2000s. They do believe that there is a cause worth fighting for, and if they drafted different blueprints for creating social change, they might just resurface as complex heroes. So what do you guys think? Are today's villains more interesting than past evildoers? And what do you think will come next for Hollywood bad guys? Let us know in the comments, and as always guys, peace.